Israel's moment adds to the now voluminous scholarship on this very famous event of the Zionist founding. I have the great privilege of living in Silver Spring, Maryland, and teaching at the University of Maryland, which the campus is a mile from the National Archives of the United States, which, as many of you know, hold the files of the United States Department of State, the Department of Defense, and the Central Intelligence Agency, all of the files of the executive ministries of the United States. The book also rests, I'm a historian of Germany, so one of the great challenges, actually fun as well, of working on this book was to work in the French National Archives in Pierrefitte and the French Diplomatic Archives in La Courneuve. And those of you who have not been to Pierrefitte or La Courneuve and are interested in France, I would strongly recommend a visit. And there I worked on the French Foreign Ministry files and the files of the Ministry of the Interior. The book also is about political debate here in Washington, in the Congress, and in the press, especially the left-wing and liberal press in New York, as well as the public records of the United Nations. And given the centrality of the United Nations to the founding of Israel, at least the diplomacy about it, and then the centrality of the United Nations to all things related to Israel and Zionism over the last 70 years, I would encourage those of you who are teaching or just interested to become familiar with the online files of the official document system of the United Nations, which are free and available on any computer around the world in several different languages, including English. And these are marvelous things for teaching, for students, for anyone who wants to look at the records of the General Assembly, and many, many files of the Security Council, and many, many letters by diplomats to the Secretary General. Here are core findings of the book's 500 pages. While President Truman's support for the Zionist project was crucial, and Ronald and Alice Radosh were recently added to a large literature, Walter Russell Mead has done so also, about Truman's remarkable role, the support of the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc was even more consequential, in my view, and that was evident in diplomatic battles at the United Nations, and when communist, even Stalinist, Czechoslovakia violated the United Nations arms embargo in the spring of 1948 in summer and sent weapons to the Jews when they needed them most in the War of 1948, at the same time that the State Department, first the United States and then the United Nations, imposed an embargo on arms to the region. The Soviet bloc also facilitated Jewish immigration to pre-state Palestine and to Israel. The window of opportunity, a famous phrase, those of you who work in international relations have often heard the phrase windows of opportunity. The window of opportunity for the establishment of the Jewish state was very brief. And it was made possible, first of all, by the Jews in Palestine themselves, but also by the fresh memories of the Holocaust and the anti-Nazi passions in its immediate aftermath. Israel's moment took place at a major turning point in global politics, as the alliances of the Second World War were giving way to the different and often reversed coalitions of the early Cold War. The Zionist project emerged between the binaries of communism and anti-communism, West and East. And this fact confounded decision makers in Moscow, Paris, London, and Washington, but it was well understood, very clearly understood by David Ben-Gurion and Moshe Sharett. And that's part of their brilliance and their courage and their insight. It must not be underestimated. The second point, perhaps due to the understandable attention devoted to Truman and his support for the partition resolution in November of '47, and then his decision to recognize the new state on the day that it was founded, historians have not paid sufficient attention to the emphatic, persistent, and consequential opposition to the Zionist project from the United States Department of State, the Department of Defense, and the Central Intelligence Agency. Israel's moment presents more evidence than has appeared in the scholarship up till now about an anti-Zionist consensus that emerged at the top of the United States national security establishment, represented by the second most famous and second most prestigious individual in American public life after the President of the United States, Secretary of State George C. Marshall, who had been a five-star general and Chief of Staff of the Army during World War II, and articulated by the first director of the new policy planning staff, a man who within foreign policy circles was as prestigious and influential as one could be without being a famous public figure, and that, of course, is George F. Kennan. These leaders and the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Pentagon viewed the establishment of the Jewish state as a threat to American and Western access to Arab oil resources and as a boon for Soviet and communist expansion in the Middle East. And therefore, it was a threat to the national security interests of the United States in the early months and years of the global policy of containment of the Soviet Union and communism. Anti-communism and support for the Jewish state in 1947-48 in the power ministries of the United States government here in Washington and in the British Foreign Office in London did not go hand in hand. The thrust of the early Cold War and the policy of the containment was pushing against the Zionist project in the power ministries. Third, though support for the establishment of the Jewish state in the United States encompassed both the Democratic and Republican parties, Robert Wagner, the famous, so important for passing the Social Security and the New Deal legislation, as well as Robert Taft, Mr. Republican, an isolationist in the 30s, the loudest and the most, both of them supported the Zionist project, the loudest and most persistent voices in the political realm in this town, outside the formal organization of the synagogues and the Jewish community organizations, came from the most prominent liberal politicians in American politics and from prominent liberal and leftist intellectuals and journalists. And these figures included Wagner, the Congressman Emanuel Seller from Brooklyn, the spark plug of congressional support for the Zionist project, a remarkable man, former Assistant Secretary of State Sumner Welles, journalist Frida Kirchway, I.F. Stone, and writers for The Nation, the left-leaning dailies, the flagship of the American Popular Front, non-communist, soft on communism, left in the United States, the newspaper PM, the New York Post, and all of those journalists denounced the Nazi collaboration as past of the leaders of the Arab Higher Committee. They viewed the Zionist project as part of a broader and global era of anti-colonialism and a logical continuation of the anti-Nazi, anti-fascist, anti-racist passions following the war and the Holocaust. And they all rejected accusations that there was a connection between the Zionist project and Soviet and communist expansion in the Middle East. The old coupling of Jews and communism, Judeo-Bolshevism, would not be articulated in the State Department. That would not be polite. But this suspicion that there was some connection between the Soviet Union and the establishment of the Zionist project was clearly articulated in many memos in the British Foreign Office and the State Department. And one of the things that the foundation of the Zionist project brings to mind again is how close the special relationship was between the Foreign Office in London and the State Department in Washington. Fourth, the Nazi collaboration is past of the leaders of the Arab Higher Committee, which Bernard Lewis did so much to remind readers of in 1986 in Semites and Anti-Semites. This Nazi collaboration is past was not a secret. It wasn't something that depended on newly declassified documents of the 1980s and 1990s with the 30-year rule. It was a subject of major public debate in the United States and at the United Nations, it was noted. The public record of those years also indicates that Jamal Husseini, the United Nations representative of the Arab Higher Committee, was explicit in London in January of 1947 and in New York in September of 1947 that the Middle East, in his view, was a racial homogeneity. A racial homogeneity. And the Zionist project was an alien element in this, in his view, racially homogeneous region. And one of the great accomplishments of the Palestine Liberation Organization and the Soviet Union's propaganda during the Cold War was to reverse the realities of racism and anti-racism in 1947 and 1948. Because in 1947 and 48, or 45 to 49, it was generally understood that the problem was that the Arabs and the not all, but the leadership of the Palestine Arabs and the Arab League were making racist arguments against the intrusion of this alien presence. So the notion that Zionism was a form of racism must be understood as one of the great propaganda accomplishments of the 20th century, because it completely reversed the realities of what was actually taking place in those years. Fifth, the book offers more details about the refusal of the French Foreign Ministry to extradite Haj Amin al-Husseini for trial when he was held under house arrest near Paris in 1945-46. He was captured by the French army in May of 45, and the files of the French Foreign Ministry on the Husseini file are three or four large folders, and they are fascinating, that indicate the conversations between Henri Ponceau, former French diplomat in Lebanon, and Husseini, indicating that the French Foreign Ministry was drawing the conclusion that getting on the good side of the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem would facilitate French, call it colonial, call it just French presence in North Africa and the Middle East. And those conversations and at the same time that there were the liberals in New York and Seller in Washington were yelling, extradite him to Nuremberg. And the British were urging the French to extradite him to London so they could send him to some island away from Palestine. The French didn't. And the files of that back and forth between Britain and France, and then his, quote, escape to Cairo in 46, I found some of the most interesting research in the book. Also extremely interesting and not well enough known is the split within the French government. And you can see this in Washington, where the Department of Justice kept pushing back against the Department of Treasury and the State Department and the FBI because the State Department was trying to get the Department of Justice to arrest various Zionists or crack down on pro-Zionist activities. Well, in France, the Ministry of Interior was led by two socialists, Edward Depreux and Jules Moch, and they were, without leaving a huge public paper trail about their sentiments, they let actions speak louder than words generally. They worked closely with the Mossad in facilitating Jewish emigration to Palestine from 1945 to 1949, and that is that collaboration between the Ministry of Interior and those who were supporting Jewish emigration through Marseille and trying to break the British blockade was the beginning, in my view, and French historians have more work to do in this regard, of the most consequential alliance that Israel had in the first decade of its existence. And that was its alliance with France. And more work needs to be done on that. Now, after the Soviet Union launched its anti-Semitic, anti-cosmopolitan purges beginning in late 49, excuse me, I didn't mean to. Stalin concluded that Israel was not going to be an appendage of Soviet influence, and it then embarked on the unfortunately successful 40-year propaganda campaign that I referred to a moment ago, that reversed the realities of those years, and succeeded in, quote, blaming the United States and American imperialism for Israel's emergence. It was silent about the evidence of the era of Soviet and communist support for the Jews in Israel, and it spread the consequential falsehood that Israel was a product of U.S. imperialism, and that the echoes of that accusation of Israel as a colonial settler, or a racist phenomenon, those are echoes in the language of the 21st century of a falsehood that the Soviet propagandists began to spread in the 1950s. In the United States, the importance of Soviet-era support for the Zionists and the realities of opposition in the power ministries of the United States government was lost in the Jewish community, often, in an exaggeration of the importance of Truman's decision-making and a minimization of the impact of opposition from our national security establishment. There's an element of romanticism in the American Jewish community about the realities of the relationship between the United States government and the establishment of the State of Israel, and the habits of thinking about Zionism that emerged in the late 40s, articulated by Kennan and Marshall and Robert Lovett, Roy Henderson, James Forrestal. Those habits of thinking about Israel, national security interests of the United States, they created deep traditions within the State Department and the Pentagon that did not change, as several people pointed out yesterday in talks. It really didn't change fundamentally. It began to change a bit under Kennedy and Johnson in the 60s, but the argument that Israel was an asset to American strategic interests didn't really emerge until after the Six-Day War. The book goes into the efforts of Robert Wagner, Emanuel Seller, the liberals in New York. Let me go through a few. I'll go through a few images. This is Alba Silver and Stephen Wise, who were co-chairs of the American Zionist Emergency Council. The American Zionist Emergency Council, in the summer of 1945, wrote the first of a number of excellent memos about the relationship between the Arab leadership, Husseini and others, and collaboration with the Nazis. And they gave these memos to the State Department. And they urged the State Department to release the files that we now know the United States government had in its possession about the realities of Nazi collaboration. They did everything they could. Everything they could. They met at the State Department. They presented superb memos. Benjamin Netanyahu's father, Benzion Netanyahu, had some connection with AZEC, and he contributed as well. And so when people talk about Jewish power or Jewish influence or the Jewish lobby, one of the things that comes through when you look at the efforts of AZEC in those months and years was how little influence they had, and that their efforts to the State Department would not unleash or declassify the many memos it had that Bernard Lewis referred to, Lucas Harasowitz, many of us now have seen, and decided not to wage a political battle publicly here in this country at the United Nations about the specter of Nazi collaboration, which would have, from a strategic point of view, would have put the rejectionists on the defensive. I don't have time to talk in detail about what I consider to be a failure of American foreign policy in these months and years, and that was the decision not to put Hashim bin al-Husseini on trial. There were German officials. Husseini did not cause the Holocaust. Bibi Netanyahu exaggerated greatly. The Holocaust, if he hadn't never lived, basically much of the same thing, well, it would have happened. He was not a decision maker. He was a man on the run. He was dependent on the Nazi regime. He was not a decision maker in the Holocaust. That said, there were German officials who were tried in Nuremberg and the successor trials, rather, for their propaganda activities. and incitement, anti-Semitic incitement. And that was something that Husseini had a very extensive paper trail and audio trail about. And had that happened, and this is one of those what ifs, this is just a what if, I can't demonstrate it to be the case. I think that his prestige and the prospects for his political career would have been damaged, and perhaps other more moderate leaders in Arab Palestine could have come to the fore. The Jamal Husseini quote about racial homogeneity is very revealing, and I hope that in the months and years to come that students who take courses here will learn more about Jamal Husseini's views of racial homogeneity, and that directors of offices of diversity and inclusion will also pay some attention to it. These are the famous Arabists of the State Department. George Wadsworth, Loy Henderson, a large lecture hall in the State Department is named after Loy Henderson, who was really one of the spark plugs of anti-Zionism in the State Department. Pickney Tunk, who was an excellent ambassador, actually, to Egypt during the war. And then Colonel William Eddy. More about Eddy in a few moments. This is a mass demonstration at Madison Square Garden in New York in 1946, and it captures the mood of the time. Escape for the Nazi Mufti, but no rescue for Nazi victims. Again, this is not in the archives. This is not secret. This was the mood of 1945-46 in New York, and a mood that is often forgotten. This is Henri Ponceau, the French diplomat who spoke with Husseini. This is Frida Kirchway. I mean, wow, her articles in The Nation were just eloquent, passionate defenses of anti-fascism, anti-racism, and Zionism, and they all fit together into the same, in her mind, the same view. She was a spark plug, and the Nation magazine played a very important role in presenting the case, the Zionist case, to the United Nations as well. Zionism was a cause célèbre of liberals and the left in 1945 to 1949. Because people, for many reasons, but one of them was that people saw opposition to Zionism as an expression of anti-Semitism. This is Wagner, that is Seller. Seller, this is before email, before he could get 70 people, 80 people, 100 people in the House of Representatives to sign a letter, which they then sent to Truman, or they sent to Secretary Marshall. He was tireless, and he was as brilliant as Kennan, and the people in the State Department you can see in their memos, they began to understand that in Emanuel Seller they had met their match. This congressman from Columbia, who also had a law degree from Columbia, congressman from Brooklyn. Sumner Welles took to task his successors in the State Department and argued that the State Department and the Pentagon were following the interests of the oil lobby. This is not. This is somewhat. The photo is not as good as I would like, but on the left is Andrei Gromyko. In the middle is Alfred Fiedorkiewicz, and on the right is Tigriv Lee at the United Nations. Alfred Fiedorkiewicz was elected to be the vice president of the General Assembly of the United Nations. He was a representative from Poland. And in May of '47, a week before Gromyko gave the famous speech supporting a two-state solution, Fiedorkiewicz gave a speech in a smaller committee in which he said that the Polish government supported the Zionist project for a number of reasons. But one of them was that the Jews needed a state to survive and in a dangerous world. And how did he know this so personally? Because Alfred Fiederkiewicz, the vice president of the General Assembly of the United Nations, had survived Auschwitz-Birkenau. And that he said, I was there and I saw 1.5 million people killed. And they're stunning. And this, Fiederkiewicz and Gromyko, they mentioned the murders of the Jews. Nobody used the phrase Holocaust then, that I know of. Warren Austin, the American ambassador, did not mention those things. So you look at the UN records and you say, well, who is talking about what happened in Eastern Europe? Who is talking about the death camps in Poland? I'm sorry to say, it was primarily the Soviet and Soviet bloc representatives. You can say they did so for cynical reasons, and look what happened later, and I understand all that. But those are the moods of 1947, 48. I'm going to skip the French connections. They're fascinating. Again, I stress, I think that they are the beginning of what was the most consequential alliance that Israel had of its first 10 or 15, with the first 2 decades up to 1967, and that was with France. So there we go. There is Truman on the left and George Marshall on the right. And those are the 2 most famous persons in American politics, the 2 most influential figures. So what they were doing in the spring of 1947 was launching the Cold War. Everything about the Zionist project was a sideshow. The main event was containing the Soviet Union and containing the Soviet Union in Europe. Rebuilding Western Europe, starting the Marshall Plan, launching the policy of the global containment of communism. That was the key. That's what they both agreed on. And these are 2 anti-communists. That was the primary focus. And so there was no way that Harry Truman could fire Secretary of State George Marshall in order to accomplish what they both wanted to do, which was this major reorientation of American foreign relations from the mentalities and passions of the Second World War, to convince the American people that, in fact, the Soviet Union, while it had been a wartime ally, was now a foe, an adversary. There's Marshall giving, at the Harvard commencement in 47, in June, when he gives the famous speech about the Marshall Plan. And the economic reconstruction of Europe, especially Western Europe. There's Gromyko in November. There is Jamal Husseini on the left at the United Nations. There's Stone. This is Robert Lovett and George Kennan. And there is the special relationship with the United Nations. That's Marshall on the left and Ernst Bevin on the right. And I think that many of you are familiar with Bevin's emphatic opposition to the Zionist project, which William Roger Lewis, the historian of British Empire and decolonization, has described so well. I think I'm going to stop with we'll come back to that later. By spring of 47, the momentum, the emotional momentum in Europe and the United States and other parts of the world in favor of the Zionist project was growing. And over the summer of 1947, from the perspective of the British Foreign Office and the perspective of the State Department, things got worse and worse because, in part, of the very famous Exodus affair of July and August, in which, and here all of you are familiar with this, but just to remind you that the Exodus sailed from Marseille was then stopped by British destroyers. The passengers were taken off the boat. They were put on several other ships. The ships then sailed back. The British wanted the French to take the Jewish refugees off the ships, and Edward de Proux and Jules Mock, who were in control of the ports and visas and everything, said, no, they're not coming off. They want to go to Palestine. They're not coming off. And the British were furious, and at the French, at de Proux and Mock. But the result was a political, diplomatic debacle for Britain, and more emotional support for the refugees and for the Zionist project. So it's at that point, in the summer of 47 and the fall of 47, that the United States State Department and the British Foreign Office begin to organize something called the Pentagon Talks in September and October of 1947, which is a meeting in the Pentagon of British and American military and diplomatic officials. Again, I found the records of those preparations for those meetings and then the meetings themselves fascinating, because it's at the Pentagon Talks that Kennan and Henderson articulate the implications of the policy of containment regarding the Mediterranean. And the implications of that are that the establishment of the State of Israel is undermining the policy of containment and is a danger to the United States national security interests, and therefore we must oppose it. It's bad for the oil, access to the oil, and it's good for the Soviets. It's good for the communists. So there is no way in which the establishment of this state helps the United States or Britain in the early months of the Cold War. And one of the key memos that launches those arguments is by William Eddy, who had been the American ambassador to, or consul to Saudi Arabia, and then he worked with the Arab American Oil Corporation, Aramco. And Eddy says, if there is a Jewish state established, we will not be able to have access to the oil. It will benefit the Soviets. And the language of the Eddy memo, which is very smart and astute and all that, is picked up in even more important memos. It's one thing for the oil guy to say that Zionism is a bad idea. And people could say, well, that's Eddy, right? He went native in Saudi Arabia. This is a Texas guy, or oil industry. What's important is that it wasn't just Loy Henderson or Eddy, but George Kennan, the most famous analyst in the State Department, the author of the fundamental arguments about containment. And the Kennan memos of January and February of 1948 replicate the basic arguments that Eddy had laid out in September, that again make the case that the Zionist project was at odds with the national security interests of the United States of America. Whatever sins or problems or faults one may find with the State of Israel, one of the major takeaways from not only Israel's Moment, but other works, but Israel's Moment goes into it more extensively, is that the State of Israel was not the product of American imperialism. And if the British Foreign Office and the State Department and the Pentagon had their way, they would have not supported the partition plan. They attempted to undermine the partition plan in the spring of 1948. They failed. Given the war in Ukraine, I thought I would emphasize a Ukrainian note here. And just a couple more minutes and time for your comments and questions. Vasyl Tarasenko, who after the war became the chair of the history department at Yamchenko University in Kiev, was the Ukrainian representative to the United Nations, and he had a rotating seat as a representative of the Ukrainian SSR on the Security Council. And the this is a this is Tarasenko, it's Gromyko, that's Noel Baker of Britain, and then Warren Austin is off, not in the photo, but he's there. And in the spring and summer of 1948, the United Nations Security Council debates about the various truce resolutions are a bit head-spinning, and the details can get a bit bewildering, but also fascinating. And what you see in spring and summer of 48 is Tarasenko and Gromyko up against Baker and Austin. And what are they doing? They're supporting Moshe Shertok. They're supporting Abba Eban when there are arguments about what kind of truce resolutions the United Nations should propose before and during the war. And Tarasenko and Gromyko are saying these truce resolutions are favoring the Arabs. They're undermining Jewish advances. Tarasenko, in view of Putin's description of the Ukrainians as Nazis, and we European historians know a lot about, you do as well, about Ukrainian collaboration with the Nazis, and so we're not going to get into that. But Tarasenko said that a resolution supported by the Britain and the United States was designed to stifle the state of Israel, he said. The whole draft resolution was biased and unacceptable as a result. And another American-British effort to thwart Zionist successes was the Bernadotte resolutions of the summer of 48, which would have amputated the Negev Desert from the state of Israel. That was supported by the British Foreign Office and the State Department. And at the United Nations, Shertok and Eban argued vociferously against it, and the support they got came from Tarasenko and Gromyko. To end with a telling anecdote. Moshe Shertok gave a splendid speech in May of 49 at the United Nations as the first, when he spoke first, not as a representative of the Jewish Agency, but as a representative of the new state of Israel, after the state of Israel had been admitted to the United Nations as a membership in May of 49. It's a long speech, and I quote significant chunks of it and then summarize. But he referred to two notable occasions when the United Nations refused to endorse retreats from a policy which would either have annulled the independence of Israel or crippled its territory. Ever the diplomat, Moshe Shertok did not mention who he was referring to. But it was very clear to everyone in the room that he was referring to the efforts of the United States Department of State in order to annul the partition resolution and then to try to push back against Israel's military gains during the war. And nevertheless, Israel's policy would be friendship with all peace-loving states, especially the United States and the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republic. It's a brilliant, very frank speech that indicates that here is a diplomat who also knows how to speak clearly to those who understand what he's talking about. But to conclude with this last anecdote, in May of 49, the State Department was very unhappy with David Ben-Gurion because he was arguing that the issue of the return of refugees had to be put off, or rather included, in negotiations for a peace agreement. And the Arabs were refusing to do that. And it fell to James MacDonald, the first United States ambassador to Israel, to present the bad news that the State Department was, quote, considering its relations with the State of Israel, unless Ben-Gurion and others had a different policy on refugees. And it's part of the letter said essentially, after all the United States had done for the Zionist project, it had a right to have its views considered. And Ben-Gurion, who was not known for flowery rhetoric or great eloquence, but it could be blunt, replied to MacDonald, according to MacDonald's notes, as follows: the November 29 resolution was never carried out by the United Nations. It contemplated 2 states. That didn't happen. Instead, an embargo encouraged aggressors against Israel. And then Ben-Gurion said to James MacDonald, had the Jews waited on the United States, the United Nations, in 1947-48, they would have been exterminated. Israel was established not on the basis of the November 29 resolution, but on that of a successful war of defense. David Ben-Gurion was never rude. He admired Harry Truman. He thanked Harry Truman. He understood Harry Truman's courage in standing up to the national security establishment in Britain and especially in Washington. But he was frank. The realities of British and American official opposition, as well as Soviet, bloc, leftist, and liberal support for the establishment of the Jewish state, faded from world politics over the decades. Following the Soviet turn in the anti-cosmopolitan campaign, the global left told a very different version, one that resonates in the Middle East Studies Association. That was a story that replaced the actual realities of 45 to 49 with influential fictions of Zionism as a form of racism and as a tool of American imperialism, and an embarrassed silence about the consequential support for the Jews that came from the communists in the spring of 47 to 49. The Zionists were not communists. They were not sympathetic to communism. The Communist Party in Israel in its first elections did miserably, and Stalin understood that, in fact, there was no connection between Zionism and Soviet support aside from small leftist parties. The forgetting of the Nazi collaboration of the leaders of the Arab Higher Committee and the guilty association of Zionism with communism were aspects of the early years of the Cold War. Israel's moment, as I said at the outset, was that brief period, that window of opportunity of 47 to 49, or 45 to 49, when the passions of anti-fascism had not yet been displaced by those of global containment and anti-communism. These conclusions may be obvious to this well-informed audience. On American campuses, they challenge a very different conventional wisdom, one that began in world politics, in attacks on Israel's legitimacy, and subsequently found a home in parts of the academy and the press. Perhaps the contrasting insights of David Ben-Gurion and Moshe Sharett in 49 are common knowledge in Israel today. Whether or not that's the case, my work in the archives that led to this book offers abundant evidence that Ben-Gurion and Sharett understood very well who in international politics had supported and who had opposed the anti-imperialist and anti-racist Zionist project. Thank you.